Hi, friends. Welcome. This is week 3, lecture 3. Today, we've got a fun one. We're going to redo this API thing. We're really going to talk in depth about the request response cycle, what that looks like, the different HTTP verbs that we talked about. And I know, Christopher, you had a question on put and patch. We'll talk about the differences between those as well today. We're going to talk about use effect and promises. So we're just going to sort of give a redo a little bit of yesterday, but then we're also going to introduce Axios. We're going to introduce and replace fetch with Axios. And then lastly, we're going to talk about async and await, which is just syntactic sugar for promises, and show you another way to do it. I actually created 4 different ways we can do it and sort of the times that we want to do the different things. So there's plenty of ways for you to do it. And then we'll see how we can then chain or have async await within use effect and go from there. Before we get started, just wanted to, as always, there's some discussion questions that are due Sunday, February 26th by 11:59 p.m. PST. And then you only have one core assignment. This is to-do list. Now I know it's a more challenging assignment, hence why we only do one. So if you do need help, I would say there are people in Dojo Hall that aren't necessarily just TAs, but students that are constantly working together. So I'd encourage you to do that. Working together is a great way to learn, because sometimes you know something and your friends don't, or your cohort mates don't, and then you can teach them. And sometimes when you're teaching, you're like, wait, I'm confused. And it just helps you reiterate, because you're like, oh no, for sure, I'm going to remember that. And it actually helps you learn more. So, I mean, I learn all the time, even though I've been doing this for like 3 years. So cool. Before we sort of jump into the new material of Axios and async await, I wanted to talk about the request response cycle. And I made this sweet little thing. Let me go ahead and we're gonna have some fun. I made this today. Let me present it of what is a REST API. So the request response cycle is really just us making a request to something. In this case, we're talking about an API, but really just if we're thinking about the request response cycle of, if I go to google.com, I am making a request, or if I want to go to Facebook, I'm making a request to some server, right? Or some DNS, and it's going to give me a response. It's either going to give me facebook.com, or it's going to give me an error that says, that doesn't work, or facebook.com doesn't exist. Or if, like GitHub, if I put GutHub, Microsoft bought both of them to actually just redirect and say, no, what they really wanted was this. So even whenever I make the wrong request, sometimes I can get a response back that is correct and accurate. So how that works with an API is we've got this cool little visualization. I've got a little bit more intense one after this, just to show you the depth of APIs. But what's going to happen is, here's our client website or application. So this is meaning that we can have it from a cell phone or a tablet or a desktop. It doesn't necessarily change. We're still making a request, and we're still going to hopefully get a response. So when we say, let's say we're going to our same rec-res API, that's what we're going to work with today. We are making a request. Now, when we're dealing with the request, there are 4 HTTP verbs, or we're going to talk about 5, really. But these are the main 4 ones. There's a GET as a GET request. A GET request is going to be your most common, right? That is oftentimes in languages, that's actually the default. Like in different language, like in Python, I believe it's a GET request is by default. So if I'm saying I want to redirect, or even, most languages, GET is a default. I want this, go ahead and give me that. I'm just getting some information. My post request is I am giving some information. You can think about like a form. A form is always going to be a post request. If I'm creating a new user, I'm signing up for something, I'm wanting to get something that, like, I want to give them some information. That is a post request. A put request is when I'm wanting to change or edit my information. And then my delete request is when I want to delete some sort of information. Now, we're going to get more in depth with this when we actually get into a database. But really, my GET request is where I'm asking you for something, please give me some information. My post is I'm giving you some information. But there's also another one called patch. And here's the main difference. You might see put or patch kind of used simultaneously. The main difference is oftentimes, and it does depend on the API, but normally this is how it works, is if you're doing put, you're replacing the information, you're editing the information, but you have to edit, resubmit all of the information. So for example, let's say that I have a Facebook account that's got my first name, my last name, my email, and my password and my birthday, right? Well, let's say that I decide, you know what, I'm going to change my first name from Will to, I don't know, like Randy, right? Well, if I use a put request, what I have to do is not only do I provide my new first name, but I also have to provide all the other material because I'm basically rewriting the entire object or user or whatever we're doing. If I'm doing a patch request, that is, and again, this does vary by API, but that allows me just to edit one thing. So if I just want to change my first name, I don't have to supply the same last name and birthday and email and password. So that's the difference between put and patch. Put, again, you have to replace sort of everything. Patch, you can just replace one thing. And then delete is, okay, I'm going to identify this is the user I want to delete. We usually use a unique identifier, like an ID is going to be a great one. Same thing for put and patch. If we want to edit, we edit. We're going to have an ID. And then delete, we want to delete by the ID so we know that we're deleting the right one. Again, we're going to get into that. But those are the 4 type of requests. They're called HTTP verbs. But oftentimes, again, you're going to use a GET request. So let's say hypothetically in this REST API, we are making a GET request saying, I want some information. Here's my REST API. You can sort of think about a REST API as like a traffic controller, right? Where they are getting all of these requests and they're saying, okay, you're a GET request for a user list. Okay, I want you to go here. Or you are a post request, you wanted to create a new user. Okay, let's go here, right? And they're controlling where they're going to send you on the web server, right? So you have some sort of server, some backend. We're going to create one in Node. So it's going to be Node.js. That's going to be our web server. And it's going to say, okay, this is the part of the server I want you to take that information to, or I'm going to take the information to. Sometimes the web server has the information and it can just give back the response. So here's the, you can kind of associate all of the arrows coming back as the response, all the arrows going forward, that's the request. So sometimes the web server has enough information to go ahead and give you back a response, right? And then the REST API passes that response back to you. And then now you see some sort of information, right? Other times, if we're getting like a user list associated to my friends, right? Let's say I create a Facebook and I'm on my profile and I want to see all of my friends. The web server then has to take that response and go to my database, which I spelled wrong, it's just one word. Go to my database, give the request, make some sort of query, which we're going to use MongoDB to do that. The database gives me back the information that I'm needing. My web server gives that back. And then the API gives me back my response and I see my friends list on my page. Now this happens wicked fast. This happens very, 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 very quickly. One thing to note is it's often not this simple though. It's often not just you have one API and what we're doing for right now, we do, but sometimes we have something like this where I make a request, right? The client makes some sort of request to our API. It sends it to our web server and it's realizing, okay, our web server has some sort of function that calls another API, makes another request to an API. That API goes to its web server, maybe something from its database, brings it back, gives it back. Simultaneously, maybe we're also querying our database, bringing back information. It bundles everything back up, and then it gives us back our response. Now, this is just an example of us making a request and only 2 APIs being hit, but there are, there can be tons and tons and tons of APIs that are happening. This can be happening, this API could call another API. And so you sort of have this tree of APIs, but really what you need to think through, or what you just really need to associate an API with, is how is it handling my request? Is it giving, once I give my request, it's going to give my server and say, this is what I need you to do. Or it's going to say, okay, I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it here. You're trying to just get this information. Cool. It's located here on the server. Server gives back that response and it brings it back to my users. That's the request response cycle. And this is throughout development, not even APIs necessarily. It's just a very common cycle. You should have learned about it literally day one of Coding Dojo. It should have been taught to you in Web Fundamentals, but I wanted to go over this one more time and also see how APIs integrate into this request response cycle. Does that make sense? How does this sit with you guys? Is this a little bit more of a better, clear thing compared to my grandma analogy yesterday? Same sort of thing though, right? Grandma makes a request, goes and gets it. Sometimes you got to go back somewhere, back of the kitchen to find it, come back, and then bring it back to the grandma. Cool. Okay. Love Canva. If you guys don't use Canva, it's very easy to make stuff. It's pretty awesome. Okay. Again, I need some water. I'm literally next to a heater and I'm on fire. Okay. So that is that. What I next want to talk about is going over what we talked about with use effect and promises. So yesterday in our code, we introduced this new hook called use effect, which is right here, right? It's similar to use state. So if I do that, I have to import use effect, and I do it the same way I would do use state. And if I wanted to also import use state, which I will, because I'm going to need it, I'm going to say use state. Perfect. Cool. So we talked about that this is a hook. And what this does is it basically runs this thing called side effects. So I'm going to say runs. Now what this does is use effect allows us that to basically put something in motion the minute a component or the minute this component is rendered. So if you were in office hour, then you saw that there were two different types where we can make an API request based on when we want, like whenever we want, like if we click a button, then we make an API request. For example, for this one though, let's say that we're going back to Facebook and I want to see all of my friends. If I click on a page and it's my friends list, and then now this new component comes in and it's this component that has my friends in some sort of grid, I don't want to press a button to see all friends. I just want my friends to show up there. That's where use effect comes in. It allows us to run some bit of information when this component is what we call mounted, meaning that it goes onto the DOM. And then basically once this component is rendered, we run this code immediately. Any questions on use effect and what it's doing? Can anybody remember what this is called? This second piece of use effect. Talked about it yesterday. Anybody? Commented in the code? It is technically a secondary argument. It is called a dependency array. It is called a dependency array. Now, what this is doing is if I have this empty and just sort of let's do this. To use effect is basically this right here, right? It is a function that takes in a callback function. So it's a higher order function. The second argument is this array right here, this guy. This is called a dependency array. Now, what this allows us to do is we can have multiple use effects or multiple use effects. And in here, I can put some sort of state or component. If I wanted to, let's say every time this updates, if I wanted to update my user state, I could do that and say, whenever this, like if I had something like this, let's say const users, const users, comma, set users. I could say every time my users is updated, let me spell that correctly. Every time this state is updated, I want you to run this code again. Now, what will happen is one thing to note and we'll look at this when we actually open up this code, is if you never, ever, ever want to use set your setter in the same use effect that is dependent on your getter. Because what will happen is, let's say that we were doing something like this. This isn't running, so I'm not going to break it. But let's say instead of console logging, I wanted to also, I'm going to just trying to get my brackets because that's always an issue. I wanted to set users to data. If this happens right here, because this use effect is running every single time users is updated or changed, once this starts, I'm going to have this data. I'm going to come here. I'm going to take this response. I'm going to set users, which means that users changed, right? So it's going to get here. Then it's going to run fetch. It's going to reset users, which means, again, users changed. And then it's going to come here and you're going to come into this infinite loop, right? To where you're constantly doing this. And then what you'll see is that React is just going to say, hey, I broke. Like it doesn't, too much in the stack. Can't do that because you're in some sort of infinite loop. So just one thing to always keep in mind is never have a setter in the same use effect that your getter is in, is dependent on, or in your dependency array, because then you'll just be in an infinite loop. Now, by leaving it empty, what this actually allows us to do is say, hey, once that component is mounted, once it is ran, then run this. But once that's done, don't run it again. Like it's not dependent on anything. So you just sort of run it once and that's it. If you refresh the page, then it runs, right? Because the component is mounted again. But it's not dependent on any sort of state or any sort of anything being changed. Cool. Does that make sense? Does that a little bit more clarity of what's happening there? Cool. Great. Now, yesterday, we also talked about fetch. Can anybody remind me what fetch does? Anybody remind me what fetch does? Or what does it allow? It's a promise. Yeah, exactly. If I were to hover over this, it's what we call a promise. Kat, what does a promise allow us to do? Yeah, exactly. Asynchronous stuff. So what a fetch is it's what we call a JavaScript promise and allows us to run stuff asynchronously. Right now, normally JavaScript runs something synchronously, meaning that it goes top to bottom and it waits for the line above to finish running until it goes to the next line. Whenever we do a promise or we have a promise, what it allows us to do or allows our computer to do to start this process or this function. But then it also is allowed to do other things simultaneously, create what we call a new thread. So that way we can start doing other computational things while this is still running. So it's running concurrently side by side versus having to wait for this to happen and then go ahead and console log or do whatever. That's really important because sometimes when we're making these API requests, we don't know how much data is happening or what exactly is going on. And so it could be a little bit, even if it's 3 or 4 seconds, right? Because it's so much data, that 3 or 4 seconds is a lag for our user and it doesn't create for a good user experience. And so what fetch does, it allows us to run code asynchronously so that while this is running, our code can do other things. Now, you notice that there's a then and a catch, a then and a catch. And in the platform, it talks about promises. I can't remember exactly where it talks about promises, but it talks about there's 2 different things. Let's try to find it. About promises, yeah. We've got our resolved and rejected. Like that is what a promise takes in and has, right? Either it's resolved, meaning everything worked well. We made this request, we got the information back, all is good, or it was rejected, meaning, hey, we have an error. And so here, when we're dealing with fetch, and we're going to see another way of how to do this too, But what we can do is use a dot then, and dot then represents, hey, when things go right, what do you want me to do? And a dot catch that says, when there's an error, what do you want me to do? Now, somebody yesterday brought up that, hey, if I don't have this, my code still runs fine. And that's true. It will. It'll silently handle, if there's an error, it'll silently handle this error, meaning that it's not necessarily or potentially not going to break your code or just crash your site. But what will happen though, is if you have an error, let's say you're trying to make a API request and somehow, this was different. And we saw yesterday, I sort of messed up and it still made some like secret request. It's very weird. But we have something, my request is wrong, instead of it showing or us being able to say, okay, if it is wrong or if it doesn't exist, go ahead and give me this back. And this is a better user experience, like user does not exist, or, this place does not exist if I'm using a Google Maps API. If we don't handle that error, it doesn't prepare us and it doesn't make for a good user experience. So though you can have it or have your code without it, without using dot catch, you still want to make sure that you are handling both your error and or your rejected. And you want to make sure that you're handling your resolved, which is your dot then for this case right now. Any questions?
So what is your error? Like you would just create a custom error to like the variable ERR?
Yeah. So you're going to get a response code. So it could be like a 404. So like page not found, or 401, which is like user authorization. And so that would be a great example. If I'm trying to call this API, right? And I'm trying to pass this information, let's say it's my email and a password. Let's just hypothetically, and I try to get into Google, some sort of like a Google Doc, right? And it's some secret Google Doc for Google itself. Well, I'm going to get an authorization error because I'm not authorized to view that. And so what I could do is say, if I get this certain response, if I get a 401 back, then I want to show this page I want to populate this, component, if you will, that says you are not authorized to view this file. You could do something like that. So what it allows you to do is, yes, handle and sort of predict for, if this error happens, here's how I want my user to have this, or here's what I want to show on my screen, compared to just you making a request and it not working. And the user's just going to keep clicking and saying, where's this request? But if I'm not, it's just not going to work, right? Because you have this 401, you're not authorized to view this material, but they don't know that. And so they just are trying to figure out what exactly is going on there.
So is it then on us to write a scenario for each error, like 401, 404, like all the errors that we might run into? We have to have a custom like whatever for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the class, all we're going to do is console log it. But yeah, in like production, yeah, you would want to, because it's all about user experience, right? I mean, obviously it's dependent on what application and what you're really doing, but really it's user experience. So yeah, you're going to want to handle each error individually and say, and they oftentimes, especially if you're going to like a code base that's already been created, that's already going to be there for you, because that's kind of some of the base beginning pieces. But yeah, error handling is a very big thing that you're going to have to handle.
I assume at some point today or soon we'll be actually seeing that, right? Like you creating like if we run into an error, this is what's going to actually happen, or what it's going to say.
Yeah, I can definitely go through that. Like we can take this example in like a office hour and say, okay, if there's an error, let's look at the error. Let's see the status code. What is the status code? Let's build this out to show, okay, this, I got a 401 error, so this is what's going to happen here. Yeah, Gray and I can do that in an office hour for sure.
Okay.
For this course, all you have to do, I mean, really all we're doing is console logging it, but yeah, error handling can be something that we do in office hour. Happy to do that.
Okay.
Cool. All right. Any questions on this, on promises and on use effect before we jump into today's material of Axios and then replacing fetch with Axios? Any questions? Anything I can clear up?
Don't suffer in silence. Let us know, please.
Absolutely.
Could you go over the dependency array again?
Yeah.
Just like when
absolutely.
we would actually use it?
Yeah, so if, like there was a great example of, let's say that my bank account had some sort of total number that I wanted to see on top, right? Well, if I make a deposit and I have some sort of functionality that makes a deposit, maybe that bank account number is in state. And so I can say, in my function for having a bank deposit, I update the state of my total amount to, total amount plus whatever I'm depositing. What I can do then is have use effect there that is dependent upon my bank account value to be increased. And so, or sorry, that's dependent on my total value. And so once that state changes, it'll run. And let's say I'm just even console logging, your total amount is blank. What that'll do is every time that state changes, it updates and says, now your total amount is blank, right? So I can, that is dependent on me depositing or withdrawing, and I can kind of handle that. Does that make sense? So like,
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, cool. Kind of. Okay, I'll take 5 minutes, and if I can't do it, then we'll. So let's say that I had like const account total, set account total, right? And I set it at 0. And then I had some sort of function that's going to say function. If I can spell function correctly, I'm going to say, yep, perfect. Let's say that I had just some sort of button here. I might cross this out. There's going to say on click. We're going to say handle add. Perfect. And then click here. Oops. Fine. Cool. So right now I've got this state of account total. And then I've got this handle add function that what it does is it takes that total and sets it to the total plus 1, right? So let's say that I had a use effect of use effect. You don't always have to have a fetch in there. So here I've got this guy right here. And so what this is doing is I'm going to console log. Let's say account total is perfect. Wait 1 second. Perfect. And then I need my parenthesis.
You have the use effect inside the function. I think you need an extra curly
Oh,
bracket.
because I put it within. Yep, there you go.
Yeah.
Thanks. I was like, what the heck? Okay. So I'm console logging account total is account total, right? And so what I can also do is say, perfect. Now I want this set to account total. Account total. And so what I'm saying is, okay, I want use effect. Here's my callback function. Basically, that once this is loaded, I want to print this account total. And then I want this use effect to run every time the state of account total changes. So if I run this, let's go to here. Let's call it React app. Yeah, you can start. See if this works. Should. Okay. If I inspect and I go to console, account total is 0. Now, if I click this, I see that it runs use effect because the state of account total changed because I ran this and I reset it. So then now it ran this use effect once again. And so if I click it again, I am resetting state every single time. And so then now this use effect function is running constantly. Yeah, great distinction, Chris. Use effect is not necessarily just for APIs. You can do it for APIs. That's great. But here's an example of you can have this really for your dependency array. This is just dependent on this state. And you don't have to have this. You don't have to have fetch or an API or Axios within use effect. That's what we're going to do. But like we're going to use that a lot. But use effect is just a hook, just like use state is. Cool. Anybody else have any questions on this before I get started or keep going? I did that in 4 minutes, so we still got a whole minute for questions. Did that help clarify, Michael?
Yeah.
Cool. Really use effect. All you can think about it is it's something that runs automatically when either the components ran or there's a change to some state. So cool. Go ahead and cancel these out. I'll keep them though. That way we have our code. Okay. So what we were doing, oops, not this guy. What we're doing is we're using fetch. And one of the quote unquote drawbacks of fetch is that it gives you your response or it gives you something back, but then we have to put it in JSON. If you guys remember, it was a readable stream. And so what we have to do is we have to convert it to JSON. And then once we convert it to JSON, we can chain this additional then, take in that data, we console logged it, and then we set users data, right? And so here, I wanted to show Chris, you had the data question and I did some digging, so we should be good. But here, now we're seeing that once use effect is happening, because use effect is there on with a empty bracket, meaning just basically once the component is mounted, it's running that code and we're getting this information, right? Where here we've got data and within my data is all of my information that we're needing here. Cool. Now, what I want to do, because we're console logging data and now I'm setting users to data dot data, because data, and I hope I don't lose anybody here. Data is this guy right here, this entire object that we got back. Within this, there is a key called data. And that key of data is a list of, it's an array of objects. Array of objects. Now, one thing to note, I could have called this unicorn. And it'd be the same thing. So don't get caught up on the name. This can be anything. This will still work. So refresh. Cool. Still works. Unicorn.data is this guy right here. Cool. So that's fetch. Now, we're not going to use fetch. Typically, you can still use fetch if you want, but there's another tool that you can use. It's called Axios. Now, what you do have to do is you have to go ahead and within your terminal, you have to add in Axios. So what that means is what you would do is you would say npm install Axios, and you would run this. I think it's probably already installed, so it's not going to hurt anything. Cool. Now I have access to Axios, and Axios is just another way that we can make our requests. So what I can do is instead of calling fetch and instead of using fetch, I can say something like this. I'm going to comment this out and then say using fetch. Cool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this, but with using Axios. So I'm going to say use effect. Perfect. And then now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say Axios.get. That is my get method. And I want to use my get. I just want to get some information. And then here is where I'm going to put in my actual URL. So I'm saying I want to get this information. Now, one thing I have to note is if I'm using Axios, I have to import Axios from Axios. So I want to make sure I do my import. But then all I have to do is axios.get. So let's see. Perfect. Cool. Axios.get, if I hover over this, you can see it's still a promise. It's still a promise. It just, it'll take off one of the steps for us. So if that's the case, I still have to use, where'd my mouse go? There we go. I still have to use my dot bins and my dot catch, right? Now, if I just want to say, let me say response, and I'm gonna console log it just so you can see. I'm gonna skip that part. I'm just gonna console log that. And then I'm gonna say dot catch. I'm gonna catch my error. Cool. So here, if I'm doing this, I'm using Axios, which I brought in at the top. I'm saying dot get. I'm giving it my URL. Then, if things are good, I want to take that response and I'm going to console log it. If things are not good, then I'm going to take that error and I'm going to console log it. And then here, I don't have any dependency array. I just want this to run immediately and then not run until I refresh. So if I come here and I refresh, my server is not running anymore. Whoopsies. So I installed. Perfect. Now, if I refresh, cool. Now you see that I got my response, and this is my response here. What's nice about it is with fetch, what we had to do is we had to JSONify, which is also a promise, right? I had to handle this. Axios itself will put this in JSON format for us, which is really nice. So this response automatically comes in a JSON format. Now, one thing to note, though, is the data that we want is .data. And I did this, Chris, so you could see, I did this exact API so you can see the data.data. So what it does is it packages up in this data portion. And so this is going to be a very common thing we're going to see. So if I wanted to say, instead of just that, I want to say .data. Then what I could do is come here. And now you see that instead of having this data, headers, request, I'm just getting actually the information that I want, right? Just the information that I want. Now notice within my data, this specific API has a key called data where everything lives. The specific one, not every API has this. So please don't get caught up on the .data. The first data is from Axios. The second one is specifically from this API. So if I wanted these guys, I could say .data. So let's see what this does. And now you see, I just get this list of objects, or array of objects, sorry. So again, recapping, we use a GET request. I just want to get some information. Axios then gives us that information, JSONifies it for us, and gives it back as this response. This response has a key of data. Within this specific API request, there is another key of data where my list of my array of objects lives. Where my array of objects lives, called data. Other APIs might not have this data, so please don't get caught up if you're confused by it. This first one is from Axios. The second one is from the specific API that we're dealing with. Any questions on this?
So when using Axios, the first data is always going to be called data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's part of an Axios. Like as Axios packages it up, it gives you as data.
What about with fetch? Is there specific or is it just the regular one?
Just a regular one.
Oh,
Not that I know of. There might be, not that I know of though.
okay, thanks.
Yeah, of course. Kat said the homepage for the API usually has examples of the response JSON. Yep, exactly. Thanks, Kat, for the API. The documentation is really going to help you with that. Looking. So Kat, you asked a great question. So if this is empty, does that mean every time any state is changed? No, it's anytime the the actual component or app, in this case, just app.js, but our component is mounted, meaning that it goes into our DOM. And so whenever I refresh, we refresh and put everything in the DOM, and that's why it's rerunning again. So this would just be like basically on a refresh, or in real terms, it's when a component is mounted, if this isn't in the API, the app.js. Yeah, thanks for in there. Yeah, this is not always called data. This can be called results. This could be called sort of whatever the API in itself shows. Any questions on this? Does this make sense? Can you just put a 1 in the chat if this is making sense? Cool. Awesome. So that is really the crux of Axios. That's really it. We're just going to use .post, .put / patch, or .delete or .get, and it's going to handle some of that for us. What I do want to show you is there is another way. So Gray was sort of showing this at the beginning or in the office hour. Oops. In the office hour. And so I want to show that there is other ways that we can have these asynchronous functions, or maybe we want an API request, is exactly what Gray showed in office hour. We want an API request, but we don't want it to run once the page starts, right? We want to give our users the power for this, but we still want it to be asynchronous. So I can do that. So there's 2 ways really that we can do that, but I'm gonna sort of show it, or there's a couple of ways that we can do this. So let's say I did want using async await. Oh, this is amazing that it already knows this. What I'm going to do, we're not going to use use effect yet. I'm going to show you how we can do it sort of without, and then we'll use async await within use effect. Is I'm going to say const API call, and that's going to be equal to an asynchronous callback function. What asynchronous, whenever I use async, it's just declaring just like this is a promise, right? So it's saying, okay, this is an asynchronous function. And whenever I do that, I still have to, because it's a promise, I still have to handle when things are good and when things are bad, when there's an error and whenever it is resolved, right? And so the way we would do this with an async await is instead of then dot catch, we're going to use a try catch. So we're going to say try, and whenever we have a try, that's saying, okay, if things are good to go. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create this response. This is our response, and we're saying await axios.get. So we're still having this, but we're saying, okay, this is asynchronous. Await for this to happen. And in this case, what I just want to do is I'm going to console log the response.data.data, and that's because here we're at console log.data.data. I want to see that again. Then I'm going to catch, and I'm going to pass in the error. And all I'm going to do is console log the error. So what I can do is I can create an asynchronous function. The way you do that is you just put async before the callback function call, or the anonymous function call. Then here I'm saying await. I want to get this information. If there's an error at any point, let's say I have a couple of these, like this is response 2. Let's say I have a couple of these. If at any point there's an error, it's going to come into this catch. Right? It's going to come and it's going to catch the error. So what's nice about this though is, I need one more curly bracket. Is what this allows for is instead of doing this, I can actually just pass in API call to a button. And then if I come here, I'm refreshed. Cool. You see that because we didn't use use effect, nothing has been console logged. But if I come here and I click, now I get that information. It fires off my function. I get that information and I can now see it. If I were to do something like this, if I were going to map through, right here, I would just need to have set users as response.data. And then now, if I refresh this, nothing's happened. But if I click this, all this information happens. That's using async await, and that's just, again, preparing for an asynchronous function using try catch instead of then catch to handle what is the error and if things go well. This is another way you can do it. Which way is better? There's not, I mean, sort of personal preference. Some people like the way this looks. Try catch is a pretty popular thing. Some people like the way this looks. Some people like to use dot then dot catch. It does not matter whichever one you do. The only thing is that if you wanted to use async await within use effect, it's a little bit more of a lift. In use effect. So I'm gonna have this, that way you guys have the code. But if I have use effect, I still have my my callback function. But then within that, within my use effect, I'm going to call my API call. I'm going to create the same thing with my try. Doing the same thing. But I'll show you what the difference is here in a second. Is if I'm going to use async and await within a use effect, instead of just using Axios or fetch like this, I create my variable of response. I say await Axios.get. So I'm still using my Axios.get. I am still using my setter. But one of the big things is I then within use effect have to call my function. That's just sort of how React, even if you were to try this outside of it and the actual AIR documentation, this will show how to do it, where you actually call this function within my use effect. And if I do this, this will work just fine. So if I save this and I come back, API call is not defined. Yes, it is. Oh, because now we're not doing a button anymore. We're just doing in use effect. So now you can see whenever I refresh, it still is using try catch, still using asynchronous or async and await, but now it's still showing all my information. So it's just another way to do it. The big thing is if you're going to use it within use effect, if you do like to use try catch and you want to use async await, you're totally welcome to do that. Just make sure that outside of this API call, you then call your API, you then call your function. Okay, lots of silence. How are we feeling on this?
Is there a benefit to doing it that way, or is it just,
If you
Another
like
way.
using try catch,
That's it?
Yeah, really, just kind of personal preference. Doesn't necessarily make any difference. I don't think from a speed perspective, like I don't think either one are like more performant than the other. Some people have personal preference to just using try catch. Like one of our instructors would prefer try catch. I mean, sort of indifferent. I think this is easier to me. Like this code is just easier to write than all this. But if you really like try catch and that's something you want to implement, or that is what you've done throughout, then maybe it makes sense, right, to keep it consistent and use try catch and async and await throughout everything, versus just here not using that and then using async and await. But yeah, outside of preference, it doesn't really make a difference.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Now the last one, I'm just going to copy and paste this because this is what the React documentation will tell you to do if there's a error or if you're trying to do it. And that is just with ES5 function calls. So instead of using a arrow function, this is how, like in the actual error on React, this is how it'll show it to do it. So I just wanted to show you guys. If you're like, wait, this is an arrow function in a React documentation. I looked up and asked, why does React documentation use ES5? It's just because it's consistent with how the old documentation, or not all the documentation has been increased, or not every portion of React uses arrow functions from my understanding. I've never run into something that does it. So it just said that literally it's just to keep things consistent. So if you do see the documentation saying to run it as a function, an ES5 function like this, then this is the way you do it. It's the same exact thing, but instead of creating a variable and having an arrow function, you just call your function right here, but you just put async in front of your function. And then make sure you call it outside of it. But all of these work. So I gave you 4 options of ways to do it. Technically 5, I guess, because you could use fetch as well, but yeah. And like Gray was showing, if I wanted to make sure that it wasn't on mounting of my component or when a state changed, but I wanted an API to run when I pressed a button or my user did some sort of functionality, then that's when this guy would come in handy. And you could do this, in another way too, not using. Well, no, you would still want to use this. So if you just like when we had the button and we just clicked it. So like I want to get a map and I want to click that and to like show me map. And that's when you want your API function to call. That's how you would do something like this. Okay. I believe that's all I have for tonight. Yep. Anybody have any questions? Did this help with your APIs and understanding APIs more compared to yesterday? Cool. Anybody have any questions for me? Anything that, any sort of confusion or any questions? Yay, Kat, I'd love to hear that.
Some folks don't say much, which is all right, but just let us know if you're struggling.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
We're here
if
to,
you rewatch it and you're like, oh man, like please reach out. We say this as a broken clock, we know, but we just want to make
Yeah.
sure that you guys know you can reach out.
yeah. We've got 5 minutes left. If you guys are okay, I would love to. I've got something right after this, but I can spend maybe 5 minutes after. I'd love to use another API and show you how that works, if that's okay. Okay, cool. Yeah. So I'm going to use the Swappy API and let's just look at this swappy.dev. And this is a Star Wars one. This is just really basic and common and free. So here I've got this guy, and what this is going to do is here's my base URL. And here's the information I can do. So I can try people 1 or planets 3 or starships 9. So I'm going to do people 1 because I'm going to get Luke Skywalker. I'll probably not do something basic like people 1, but let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to, ooh, yuck. Okay. Back here. Let's go ahead and it doesn't matter. So I'm going to use this. Doesn't matter. It's going to do the exact same thing, but it'll be easier. And I want to this guy right here. Cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this swappy.dev and I'll just show you sort of how I would walk through, because it's the part of the challenge is just getting through how does this work. Okay, so let's say that ooh, hate that. But I also okay, weird. I don't know whether to try it now, Kim. Okay, so here I'm calling swappy swap dev. So here's my base URL. Now we said we're going to do people, but instead of doing 1 and being basic, let's do like 4 and let's see what we get. Whenever I'm dealing with an API, there is reading the documentation is really important. So looking at this and saying, okay, if I here's a great one because I can test, see if we get somebody lame, and if so, we'll change it. I can make my request. Darth Vader. Oh, that's lit. Okay, sick. Okay. So what I see is this is what I'm going to get back is I'm going to get back a name, height, mass, all kinds of different things right here. So let's see what I can do there. is I'm going to take in just my response.data and let's see what I get. So I'm not doing anything with use state. I'm not setting anything. All I'm really doing is taking in my data, getting familiar, console logging it, and then going from there. So if I come down here, let's go ahead and get this. Go back here. We're refreshed. Perfect. So when I say response.data, this is what I get. So I can do a couple different things. I can take this information, like I'm looking and it's seeing, like I'd like to see, okay, there's a key of name, birth year, created at, films, which is all of these different films that I can do. I don't want to get too into it, but we could have some fun, and we can have multiple requests as well, right? Where I'm then saying, okay, I want to, now you've got films and I want to show all the films associated. Let's just do a few things. I'm just building this off the fly.
How can you
So
show a specific film? Like, let's say you want to show just a specific film and not all of them.
you would just get the specific, see how this has a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 6. So this is the ID of that film. And so this is that unique identifier. So if I just wanted to show whatever has this ID, I would just show this one.
Got it.
Yeah, because I would just pull that up versus iterating through. Like what I could do is I could map through these, do some things to it, add that information, and then show all that information on the screen. So let's see, I got 5-10 minutes, and then I have something after this, so I can't stay super late. But okay, let's have some fun here. So I'm going to say something like this. You guys remember? I'm going to say name, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this here. And I'm done teaching, so if you guys have to go, feel free. I'm just going to mess with this a little bit. So we got name, we got height. I got name, height. I've got mass, 136. I hope that's kilos because that's pretty light. Hair, none, and then skin color. Skin color is there. Cool. So I've got this user set user. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, how would I want to do this? Because I'm not wanting everything. Oh, wait, if I print this and I say data dot, what is this? Oh, okay, so then it's birth year. I got a whole bunch of stuff. So what I could say is set users. I don't know that I want to do response.data. Let's see what that does. Yeah, there's going to be an issue. Response. Set users. Oh. One thing to remember is whenever we want, if I just was going to do one thing, right? I was just going to set users. I don't have to have these curly brackets if it's just one line, but because I want multiple lines, then I want to do this. Okay. So let's look at my component and let's see what's happening so far. I've got some information. I have this. And you can see that not only did I get the name aspect within this, but because I had extra keys, remember that if you've got an object and you've got an object and you add in a key that does not exist, it'll automatically create that key in there. So now you see that even within my state, I have things that I didn't even add. So in theory, what I could have done is just done this, right? And just say that this is going to be an object. I come here And it's going to add in those no matter what, right? If I wanted the entire thing. Perfect. If not, then I would have had to kind of identify and do those different ones. Okay. So I've got this information. Now what I want to do is let's just do an H1. So we'll just start out by doing a H1 because I don't have a list or I don't have an array. So I'm just going to H1 of user's name. We see that it's Darth Vader. Let's say that I want H3 of user height. I want to say height. I'm going to say yeah, I think it's users dot height. Perfect. Cool. So 202. I'm assuming we're going to say, I don't know what sort of measurement that's going to be. Maybe I don't want height here. I want, let's see, what is my console? What do I have access to again? I've got maybe eye color. So let's say eye color. Perfect. Let's say. And then let's see if there is I was wondering if there was going to be a image. There's not an image. Created, edited, homeworld, mass, name. Cool. Species. Okay. So here I'm just using this and I have this guy. If I wanted to, here's what I kind of want to try. This is again, just off the cuff. What I kind of want to try is I want to say const movies, comma set movies. And what I kind of want to do is see if I can make a function that basically says, let's see, I set users. I want to then make a request within, let's make a button. Yeah, that's what we'll do. That'll be fun. So we'll say button. See movies. See movies associated. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, this is the button saying see movies associated. And then what I'm going to do is I have my state. Anybody think of a way that we could basically do these and see all the movies associated? What could we do?
We can do like a fetch request when you click the button to go into the API and pull out the very specific information for each one of those and
Yeah.
set it as that.
Yeah, I could really just do this, right? I could say like API call. I'm making a GET request. Now, what I could do is I could say something like for movie of movies. So I'm going to try this. This is not giving me what I wanted. It does not make any sense. So I was thinking, what if I had this information? Like if I were to take users dot movies or users dot, let's see, what is it called? Films. So if I were to print, or just do an H1, H4 of users dot films, what happens here? It's gonna be a list of films or an array. Yeah. So we got all this information here. So what I'm wanting to do is iterate through these and basically say, I want to make a request, get all the information from these films, and then add it into my list here. Right? Because this is going to be a list of objects. This would take way more than 10 minutes.
So essentially what you would do is you would get those numbers, pass them into a variable, have that variable be passed into a get request, and then pull the information from there, selecting the name, the data, or response.data.name, and then have that name presented on the list, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
like
I don't think
could-
you'd even have to pull the numbers. You could just
Mm.
send those like a get request to those, like the whole string as a variable.
Yeah, so I'm thinking if I've got this. And I said, let's see if I said something like, so I want it global var movie. If I said in here, I said let movie. I said for movie in users dot movies, users dot films. Not sure that this is going to work. If I were to say this, then I want to say let. I'm just gonna, oh, this movie. Let's just try this. I just said console dot log movie. Let's see what this gives us. I don't think it's gonna work. Oh yeah, it's fine. Okay, so let's go to our console. Gives me an object. Oh yeah, that's fine. That's within my API call. So now if I say this, what's happening? Oh, I made a button. I didn't say on click. Equals API call. Give me an error. Cannot read properties of undefined. So notice it gives me a 0, a 1, a 2, a 3.
Those are the keys, like the values. I think
Yeah,
it's
but if I
important
use
to
the for movie in users.films, it should have taken not the index value, but it should have taken the actual, like if I'm looking at this, it should have taken, oh, it's a key. Oh. I'm not sure that I can do. Because what it was giving me was the key. Maybe we'll do this for office hour. Because what I'm wanting to do is here's my thought. Is basically I want to, when I click that, I want to iterate through each one of these, right? And as I'm doing that, I'll fill in my try catch. I would make a get request to get the information. Because I'm now making another request for this guy, but instead I would say slash probably places slash whatever that number is. So I would get that actual information. So I get like you could do home world, right? Like home. So I would do this /planet/1. So I'd go make a request, put that into state, and then I'd be able to show that here, right? I'd be able to iterate or show that here. So that's what so maybe that's what we'll do Tuesday is we'll fix this and see how we can make this better. And start doing get requests within, maybe not just using use effect, but using this to get more information and make a request inside of a request kind of thing. So. Okay, sorry, I thought that'd be really fun. And then it kind of was like, wait a second, be a little bit more, but we'll do that on Tuesday. I'll kind of dive in and see exactly the best, most optimal way to do that. And then we'll deal with that on Tuesday. So. Okay, I will cancel the recording here.